In the heart of Detroit, a city of striking contrasts where towering skyscrapers shadow old factories and rugged streets, unfolds a story both unexpected and haunting. Here, amidst the steel and grit, a tale of ambition, love, and mystery is waiting to be uncovered, the story of Ethan Graves, a young officer rising fast within the ranks of the Detroit Police Department, and the woman who would alter the course of his life forever. Ethan Graves was a 29-year-old with the makings of a legend. Known for his strength, sharp gaze, and unbreakable sense of duty, he had made a name for himself tackling the city's toughest cases. Ethan wasn't one to shy away from danger. He dove into investigations headfirst, led by an instinct for justice and an almost eerie ability to detect lies. His superiors spoke of him with admiration, and his colleagues respected his steady resolve. Yet, behind the image of this young hero, there was a quieter truth, a longing that Ethan could barely admit, even to himself. His work fulfilled him, yes, but outside of it, a stark loneliness. After each grueling day, Ethan returned to an empty apartment, filled only with the echoes of a life too focused on the job. Friends had moved on, starting families or building lives beyond work, but Ethan? He was alone, consumed by cases, finding that thrill of the hunt was beginning to wane. The once exciting life of solving crimes left a void, as if something crucial, something unknown, was missing. It was on a crisp autumn evening in 2014 that everything changed. Reluctantly attending a networking event at the encouragement of a colleague, Ethan found himself surrounded by city officials, lawyers, and business executives. He dressed sharply, aiming to fit in, yet felt like a stranger as he wandered through the crowd. Polite nods and small talk were hardly his strong suit. He was on the verge of leaving, and then he saw her. Her name was Lena Porter. With her long dark hair cascading elegantly over her shoulders, she radiated a quiet, magnetic confidence. A simple yet sophisticated dress made her stand out, but it was more than her appearance. She moved with a kind of ease, as if every corner of the room was hers. Ethan found himself captivated. It was as though, even in that crowded room, she had drawn a line straight to him, making him feel like the only other person in the world. Ethan wasn't usually the one to initiate conversation, but he couldn't let the moment pass. He walked over, catching her eye. "Hey, I'm Ethan," he said, a small smile on his face. "You work here, or are you just as bored as I am?" Lena's laugh was warm, almost infectious. "Bored? Not exactly. I planned this event, so I guess you could say I'm working." Her wit caught him off guard, and he chuckled, feeling his nervousness slip away. And just like that, a spark ignited. What began as casual conversation turned into hours of laughter and shared stories. Lena told him of her life as an event planner, how she had built her career from scratch, organizing some of Detroit's most prestigious gatherings, and balancing it all with the pressures that came with her role. Ethan, in turn, opened up about his life on the police force, about growing up in a city as tough as Detroit, and the intense dedication he felt to his work. It was as if they were both actors from entirely different plays, yet somehow they found a shared script. Their worlds couldn't have been more different, but the connection between them was undeniable, a pull, something magnetic, that neither could ignore. There was an unspoken understanding in the way they looked at each other, a sense of knowing that neither of them had felt before. In Lena, Ethan found the companionship he hadn't realized he was missing. She brought something new into his life, an energy that filled the empty spaces he hadn't even known were there. They began to see each other more and more often, and with every meeting, that bond grew stronger. Lena's warmth, her intelligence, her resilience, they drew him in, giving him a sense of completeness he had never felt before. But as we all know, love in a city like Detroit doesn't come without shadows. And while Ethan was drawn into Lena's world, there was a part of her he couldn't quite reach, a guarded side, secrets that flickered beneath her smiles, hints of a past she wasn't ready to share. For now, those secrets remained just out of reach, masked by the growing love between them. What Ethan didn't know was that his story, their story, was only just beginning. Soon, he would find himself caught in a web of deception and danger far beyond any case he had ever worked. The love he had found, that light in the darkness, would be tested in ways he could never have foreseen. Ethan Graves, the dedicated cop who could read anyone, would face the ultimate challenge, unraveling the mystery of the woman he loved and the secrets that came with her. And so, with that meeting on an autumn night, the lives of Ethan Graves and Lena Porter were set on an irreversible path. What lay ahead was something neither of them could prepare for, something that would take them to the edge of truth and love, pulling them deeper into a story of passion, betrayal, and tragedy. In the early days, their love story felt like magic. Over a few short months, Ethan and Lena's bond deepened, blooming into something neither had ever known before. By early 2015, they had moved in together, and for the first time in his life, Ethan felt complete. Lena was more than a partner, she was his equal. She understood the weight of his responsibilities, his dedication to his job, and yet she had her own dreams and ambitions. The spark between them was undeniable, and even their friends, Lena's inner circle and Ethan's colleagues, could see it. They'd often comment on how happy he seemed, how effortlessly they fit together, like pieces of a carefully crafted puzzle. Lena brought an energy into his life that Ethan had never felt before. They traveled whenever they could, discovering new cities, laughing late into the night, and dreaming about the future they would build together. For two people who had devoted much of their adult lives to work, they had finally found someone to share life's quiet moments, its ambitions, its laughter. By the summer of 2015, Ethan was sure, he wanted Lena by his side forever. On a warm evening, under the glow of the city lights, he proposed. There were no grand gestures or elaborate plans, just the two of them in their favorite park, but it felt perfect. Lena's answer was an unwavering yes. By the end of the year, they were married in a small, intimate ceremony, surrounded by their closest friends and family. From the outside, their life looked idyllic, two successful, driven professionals madly in love, building a life that seemed like a dream. But like any story that appears too perfect, shadows lurked beneath the surface. Subtle at first, the changes in Lena were easy to overlook. She seemed more distracted, her once warm conversations shorter and distant. Ethan noticed her taking long, private calls that left her visibly tense. He chalked it up to the pressures of her business, which had been growing rapidly, bringing on more clients and bigger projects. He wanted to believe it was just stress. But as weeks turned into months, Ethan found it harder to ignore the growing unease. He was, after all, a detective, trained to notice the smallest details. He saw how Lena would avoid eye contact when he asked about her day or how she would step out of the room whenever her phone rang. She began coming home late, brushing off his questions with vague excuses that didn't quite add up. And while he tried to convince himself it was just a rough patch, something they could work through, deep down, a seed of doubt had already taken root. Despite his suspicions, Ethan's love for her held him back. He convinced himself that they could overcome whatever was causing the distance between them. But he was wrong, Lena's secret was something far more dangerous than he could have ever imagined. And that secret would soon unravel the life they had so carefully built, pulling them both toward a path of tragic, irreversible consequences. By early 2016, Ethan could no longer deny that something was terribly wrong. The woman who had once brought light and joy into his life now seemed like a shadow of her former self. The late nights continued, accompanied by hollow explanations. Lena would come home looking exhausted, slipping past him with a curt, "It's just work, Ethan. I'm exhausted." No longer the radiant, confident woman he had fallen for, Lena's presence was like a ghost haunting their once happy home. The cracks in their relationship widened. Ethan's heart ached with the weight of betrayal and confusion, but he held on, hoping for answers. He watched as the woman he loved slipped further and further away, driven by something unknown, something she kept hidden in the dark. What Ethan didn't realize was that Lena's secret would soon force him to confront a choice he never anticipated. Their perfect love story was no longer a dream, it had become a nightmare filled with whispers of lies, betrayal, and the kind of shadows that would change both of their lives forever. The question now was not whether they could mend what was broken, but whether they would survive the storm that was waiting just ahead. The warmth that once bound Ethan and Lena began slipping through his fingers like sand, leaving behind a coldness he couldn't ignore. At first, he told himself that they were simply adjusting to the pressures of life and work. But as the weeks wore on, the unease in their home grew into an unspoken chasm. It wasn't just the late nights that weighed on Ethan, it was the secrets. Lena had begun stepping out of the room to take phone calls, her voice dropping to a whisper as she shut the door behind her. From the muffled sounds he could hear, the conversations were tense, punctuated by silences that felt heavy with hidden meaning. When Ethan questioned her, she brushed him off, claiming it was a difficult client or a challenging project. But as a detective, he had spent his entire career honing his instincts, reading people's lies in the subtle shifts of their voices and the fleeting looks in their eyes. Now, those very instincts turned on him, screaming that something was terribly wrong. But each time he felt the need to confront her, he hesitated. The fear of being wrong, of accusing her unjustly, gnawed at him, and yet, the doubt only grew louder with each passing day. Soon, he noticed other unsettling signs. Lena began withdrawing large sums of money from their joint account. When he questioned her, she deflected with vague explanations of work expenses. But the amounts were too frequent, too high, and never aligned with any tangible project he could see. Their once effortless conversations turned into awkward silences, the trust they'd shared fraying like the edges of a worn-out fabric. Every dinner became an interrogation of sorts, Ethan searching her face for clues, for any crack in her guarded eyes that might reveal the truth. But Lena remained a mystery, her gaze elusive, slipping further away each time he reached out. Desperation gnawed at him, yet he couldn't shake the feeling that the woman he loved had become a stranger. By mid-2016, the tension had become unbearable. Lena's behavior grew more erratic, her disappearances stretching longer, her excuses growing thinner. She would vanish for hours without a word, and when she returned, she seemed distant, as though her mind was trapped in another world. Consumed by suspicion, Ethan began to wonder if she was having an affair. It was the only explanation that made sense. Why else would she be so secretive, so detached, so unreachable? One evening, the frustration reached a breaking point. Lena left the house earlier than usual, her demeanor tense, her clothes unusually formal. She said she had business to take care of, but something in her voice felt hollow. Ethan could no longer bear the silence of his suspicions. He waited a few minutes, then grabbed his keys and followed her into the night, knowing that this decision would change everything but unable to stop himself. He kept his distance as he followed her car, his heart hammering in his chest. The route took him to parts of the city he barely recognized, far from the upscale neighborhoods Lena usually frequented. When she finally stopped, Ethan found himself outside a rundown bar on the edge of town, a place that felt worlds away from her usual haunts. From the safety of his car, he watched as Lena stepped out, casting nervous glances around before entering the bar. Ethan debated following her inside but decided to wait. Tension coiled inside him, each second stretching unbearably as he anticipated what he might uncover. Minutes passed before the door swung open, and a man stepped out, tall, rough-edged, his face hardened by a life lived in shadows. The man's name, as Ethan would later learn, was Darius Cole, and he didn't look like a client or colleague. No, Darius Cole looked like a threat. As Darius scanned the parking lot, he struck a cigarette, his gaze sharp and cautious. Then Ethan saw Lena emerge from the bar, walking toward Darius with quick, hurried steps. They exchanged a few hushed words, and then she reached into her bag, handing him an envelope thick with cash. Darius took it, slipping it into his pocket with a curt nod before walking away, leaving Lena alone in the parking lot. Ethan sat in stunned silence, his mind racing as he tried to piece together what he had just witnessed. This wasn't an affair. It was something much darker, something that shook him to his core. What was Lena doing with a man like Darius? And why was she handing him so much money? The questions churned in his mind, each one more unsettling than the last. He drove home that night, his thoughts tangled in a storm of suspicion and fear. Ethan had followed her expecting to confirm an affair, a betrayal of the heart. Instead, he had stumbled upon something infinitely more dangerous. Lena wasn't just hiding secrets, she was entangled in a web that threatened to consume them both. And as he drove through the darkened streets of Detroit, one thing became clear: this was only the beginning. The trust that had once defined their relationship was shattered, replaced by a gnawing dread that neither of them could escape. Ethan had uncovered a crack in their seemingly perfect life, a crack that would grow into a chasm, dragging them both toward a fate neither could foresee. What he didn't know was that the events set into motion that night would unravel everything they'd built, leaving them on a path of secrets, lies, and, ultimately, a tragic, irreversible end. The world he thought he knew was about to come crashing down, and as he looked back at the night's events, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were on a collision course with disaster. Ethan sat in stunned silence, his mind reeling from what he'd just witnessed. This wasn't an affair, but something far, far worse. A shadow darker than he had imagined now loomed over his marriage. He watched as Lena handed a man an envelope, thick with cash, before slipping back into her car, her face pale and tense. Who was this man? And why was Lena, the woman he thought he knew so well, giving him money in the dead of night? Ethan had followed her expecting to confirm an affair, but what he discovered was far more dangerous, his world unraveling in an instant. Questions swirled, none with answers that brought him any peace. How long had she been keeping this secret from him? What could she possibly be hiding that was worth this much deception? As she drove off, disappearing into the night, Ethan remained in the darkness, frozen by the weight of this new reality. This was the beginning of a much darker chapter, a path lined with secrets, lies, and a tragedy neither of them could foresee. Each day after that night, he felt the distance between them widen, his suspicion digging deeper with every glance, every silence, every unspoken word. The woman he had married, the one he had trusted with his life, was becoming a stranger. And the more he tried to reach her, to pull her back, the further she slipped away. The memory of that night lingered, leaving him in a state of turmoil. His instincts as a police officer screamed at him to dig deeper, to uncover the truth. But this wasn't just another case, this was his wife. The thought of confronting her sent a wave of fear and confusion crashing over him. What could he say? What possible explanation could she give to justify what he'd seen? Days turned into sleepless nights, each one a painful reminder of the widening chasm between them. Ethan found himself spiraling, unable to concentrate at work, haunted by his doubts and suspicions. Lena, oblivious to his torment, continued her routine of secrecy, late nights, hushed phone calls, disappearing without a trace. But now, everything Ethan saw was through a new lens, each unanswered question and avoided glance cut deeper than the last. It was as if they were living in two different worlds, only occasionally crossing paths in a home now haunted by the unspoken truth. After days of silence and tension, Ethan finally reached his breaking point. He couldn't live like this any longer, constantly questioning, constantly doubting. One evening, as Lena went to bed, he slipped into the living room, his heart pounding as he glanced at her phone lying on the coffee table. He knew full well that picking it up might change everything between them, but he couldn't ignore the desperation clawing at him. Unlocking her phone was easy, he'd seen her enter the code hundreds of times. For a moment, he hesitated, guilt washing over him. Their marriage was built on trust, honesty, the very principles he was about to betray. But he knew he had no choice. Taking a deep breath, he scrolled through her messages. At first, it was mundane, conversations with clients and friends, nothing unusual. But then, he saw it, a thread of messages from an unknown number, sent over the course of several weeks. As he opened the conversation, a chill ran down his spine. The messages were filled with threats, demands for money, and accusations. Whoever was texting her wasn't a client or a friend, this was blackmail. One message stood out from the rest, stark and urgent, $150,000. You know what happens if you don't pay up. I'm not waiting anymore. His pulse quickened as he read it over and over, piecing together the grim reality. This wasn't just about money, this was about something personal, something Lena had been hiding from him for years. His mind raced, trying to make sense of it all. Who was blackmailing her, and why? What secret could possibly warrant such a steep price? And, perhaps most disturbingly, why had she kept it from him? The Lena he thought he knew seemed to be slipping away, replaced by a stranger entangled in a web of lies and danger. As he put her phone down, the weight of his discovery settled heavily on his shoulders, filling him with dread. Ethan knew that uncovering the truth was no longer a choice, it was a necessity. This was the beginning of a storm that would change their lives forever, and as he looked around their once happy home, he felt the chilling realization that they were hurtling toward a tragedy he was powerless to stop. The name Darius appeared over and over, each message brimming with threats, each one a demand for more money. Ethan's hands shook as he dropped the phone, his heart racing with the brutal truth. Darius, the man he had seen outside the bar, the man who had taken the envelope from Lena, was blackmailing her. But why? What could Lena have done to be caught in something so sinister, something worth hiding from her own husband? Ethan's mind whirled, his thoughts colliding in a storm of disbelief and betrayal. He paced the living room, every step echoing the weight of what he'd discovered. He couldn't confront her, not yet. Not without more answers. But the woman he had trusted, the woman he had loved deeply, had been keeping dangerous secrets, and now those secrets were tearing their lives apart. In the days that followed, Ethan's suspicion grew into an all-consuming obsession. Every moment away from work, every quiet second, was filled with thoughts of Lena, Darius, and those relentless messages. Sleep became elusive, concentration impossible. His mind churned with a need to uncover the full story, but he knew that a direct confrontation could be disastrous, perhaps even drive Lena deeper into Darius's grasp. He had to tread carefully. One evening, after Lena had gone out yet again, Ethan decided to take matters into his own hands. He made a quiet call to a trusted colleague at the police department, someone he knew would keep things discreet. He asked for a background check on Darius Cole, barely revealing any details. His friend hesitated, understanding the risk, but ultimately agreed, keeping the investigation strictly off the record. Days later, the report came back, and it was worse than Ethan had feared. Darius Cole was no ordinary blackmailer. His record was littered with crimes, drug dealing, assault, theft. But beyond the petty crimes lay something far more sinister. Darius had once been part of a small but notorious gang in Detroit, infamous for extortion and blackmail. Though the gang had long since dissolved, Darius had stayed entangled in Detroit's underworld, a fixer for people whose secrets were worth paying to keep buried. And then, Ethan read something that stopped him cold. An old case file from nearly a decade ago mentioned Darius's association with a woman named Lena Porter. The Lena Porter. His Lena. Ethan felt his heart sink. She wasn't just a victim, she had known Darius long before he had entered her life. They had a history, one buried deep, one she had hidden from him entirely. The file didn't delve into the details, but it was clear she had once been involved with Darius, perhaps even romantically. A shiver ran down Ethan's spine. The pieces were falling into place, but he wasn't sure he wanted to see the whole picture. Whatever had happened between Lena and Darius, it was now resurfacing, haunting their lives in ways he couldn't ignore. Armed with this devastating knowledge, Ethan knew he couldn't delay the confrontation any longer. The truth, whatever it was, had to come out. That evening, Ethan waited, his heart pounding, his mind racing with questions. When Lena finally walked through the door, her face worn and tired, she froze at the sight of him sitting in the dimly lit living room, her phone clutched tightly in his hand. "Lena," he said, his voice steady but colder than she had ever heard, "we need to talk." She stopped, her eyes wide, realizing that something was horribly wrong. "What's going on, Ethan?" she asked, her voice wavering. He stood, the messages from Darius still open on the screen as he held out the phone. "You've been lying to me about everything," he said, each word like a hammer. Lena's face went pale as she took a shaky step back. "I can explain." "No," Ethan interrupted, his voice rising. "I don't want any more lies. I know about Darius. I know about the blackmail. And I know that you've been hiding something big, something you've kept from me. So start talking." The room was silent, the weight of unspoken truths pressing down on them both. The room fell into a suffocating silence, the weight of the moment pressing down on them both. Lena's lips quivered, struggling to find the words that had evaded her for so long. Her secret, the one she had buried, concealed, and hoped would remain in the past, was now standing between them, impossible to ignore. She knew there was no turning back. The truth was teetering on the edge, and there was nowhere left to hide. Lena's hands shook as she stood before Ethan, who stared at her, his face a mask of betrayal and anger barely held in check. She could see it in his eyes, the hurt mingling with fury, the disbelief on the face of the man who once loved her unconditionally. "Lena," he said again, his voice low but sharp, "tell me everything." Swallowing hard, Lena felt her throat tighten with fear. She had always feared this moment might come, yet she had convinced herself that the past was far behind her, that Ethan would never know. But that was foolish. Slowly, her strength waning, she sank into the armchair across from him, her head lowered in shame. "I never wanted any of this, Ethan," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't want to lie, but I didn't know how else to protect myself." Ethan's expression darkened, and his voice sliced through the silence like a knife. "Protect yourself," he echoed, his tone dripping with incredulity. "From me? From the truth?" Lena hesitated, her eyes darting to meet his for a fleeting second. "From Darius," she admitted, her words almost breaking as she spoke his name. "From the mistakes I made before I met you." Her confession hung heavy in the air, each word laced with regret. Ethan's heart pounded, his anger momentarily dulled by confusion. He took a step closer, his voice softening but his intensity unwavering. "What mistakes, Lena? What did you do?" Lena closed her eyes, searching for the strength to continue, knowing that once she began, there was no turning back. "Before I became Lena Porter, I was someone else," she began, her voice thick with emotion. "I was involved with Darius. He wasn't just a random criminal, Ethan, he was my ex. I left him and that life behind, thinking I was finally free, but he tracked me down." Ethan's mind reeled as her words sank in. The woman he loved, his wife, had been involved with Darius Cole, a man deeply entangled in the criminal underworld. It was a truth almost too much to bear. He clenched his fists, his disbelief spilling out. "You were with Darius," he repeated, barely able to accept it. "Why didn't you tell me? Why didn't you trust me?" Lena looked down, her hands gripping the armrest so tightly her knuckles turned white. "I was ashamed, Ethan. I didn't want you to know about that part of my life. I thought if I could just get rid of Darius, pay him off, it would all go away. I was trying to protect us." "Protect us?" Ethan snapped, unable to hold back his frustration. "You paid him $50,000 to keep quiet, Lena. That's not protecting us, that's lying. What else have you been hiding?" His voice cracked with betrayal, his trust crumbling under the weight of her words. Lena's eyes filled with tears, her voice trembling as she shook her head. "Nothing, Ethan. Just Darius. He threatened to tell you everything if I didn't pay him. He said he'd ruin my life, our life." She looked up, her face pleading, but it only served to deepen the rift between them. The silence that followed was like an open wound, raw and painful, the truth too heavy for either of them to carry alone. Ethan felt as if the ground beneath him had given way, leaving him grasping at the shards of the life they had built together. The woman he had devoted himself to, the woman he had trusted more than anyone, had been lying to him from the start. He didn't know what to do with this kind of betrayal. He didn't know how to process the reality of her deception or how to make sense of it. The love he once held so fiercely was now fractured, tainted by secrets and lies he never saw coming. Beneath the layers of hurt and betrayal simmered something darker within Ethan, something far more dangerous than anger alone. A storm was brewing inside him, an unstoppable force he could feel rising, threatening to consume him whole. For years, he had prided himself on his control, on his ability to hold it together when everything else fell apart. But now, that sense of control was slipping through his fingers, and he didn't know how to stop it. Lena sensed it too. The subtle shift in his demeanor, the tension tightening his frame. She rose slowly from her seat, reaching out toward him, hands trembling with a plea. "Ethan, please," she whispered, her voice soft but desperate. "I didn't want any of this. I love you. I was just trying to protect our future." "Don't," he cut her off, his voice shaking with barely restrained fury. "Don't say you were protecting me." His words cut through the silence like a blade. "You've been lying to me for years, and now you expect me to just, what? Forgive you?" She took a step back, fear flashing in her eyes as the weight of his words sank in. She realized then just how precarious the situation had become. "I didn't mean to hurt you, Ethan. I thought I could fix this, I swear." But her words fell on deaf ears. Ethan couldn't hear her anymore. His mind was a whirlwind of betrayal, anger, and grief, each emotion deeper and darker than the last. Every memory they had shared, every future they had once dreamed of together now seemed twisted, tainted, a cruel joke. Without realizing what he was doing, Ethan took hold of her arm, his grip tight, his breathing heavy and ragged. "How could you do this to me?" he shouted, his voice raw with the weight of his shattered heart. "How could you lie to me like this?" Lena gasped, trying to pull away, her heart racing in panic. "Ethan, please," she choked out, her voice trembling with fear. "You're hurting me." But the sound of her fear, the pleading in her eyes, it only fanned the flames of his rage. In that moment, he felt as if he were teetering on the edge of a cliff, one step away from plunging into an abyss he'd never return from. And then, in a blinding flash of fury, he struck her. The room froze in that instant. Lena stumbled backward, her hand flying to her cheek, her eyes wide with shock and disbelief. Ethan stood frozen too, his hand still raised, his chest heaving as the magnitude of his actions hit him like a freight train. The anger that had gripped him so fiercely moments before was now replaced with a crushing horror. "Lena," he whispered, his voice breaking, I didn't mean to." But it was too late. Lena's eyes filled with tears as she instinctively turned to flee, her hands still clutching her face. In her haste, she tripped over the edge of the coffee table, her body falling hard onto the floor. The sickening sound of her fall echoed through the room, followed by an eerie, terrible silence. Ethan remained rooted to the spot, his mind numb, his body paralyzed as he struggled to process what had just happened. His breath came in shallow gasps, and slowly, he knelt down beside her, his hands trembling as he reached out. "Lena," he whispered, his voice hoarse with panic, "Lena, please." But she didn't respond. Her body lay still, the life draining from her too quickly, slipping away faster than he could comprehend. "No," he gasped, tears streaming down his face as the weight of his actions finally settled on him like a crushing wave. "No, no, no." He tried to shake her, as if he could somehow bring her back, undo the irreversible. But deep down, he knew it was futile. He had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. The woman he had once sworn to protect, the woman he had loved with every part of him, was gone, and nothing he could do would change that. As the reality of the situation crashed down on him, Ethan collapsed beside her, his body convulsing with sobs. His mind raced through the events of the past months, the lies, the secrets, the resentment that had grown like a poison between them. None of it mattered now. All that remained was the horrible, irrevocable truth: he had killed her. In a moment of rage, he had taken the life of the one person he had cherished above all else. Now, as he sat beside her lifeless body, Ethan was left with nothing but the haunting silence, the shattering regret, and the knowledge that he had destroyed the very thing he'd once thought he could never live without. The storm within him had raged, and in its wake, there was only devastation, only the irreversible emptiness of a life shattered by his own hand. The next morning, a concerned neighbor, disturbed by the sounds from the night before, knocked on Ethan's door. When no one answered, she called the police. By the time officers arrived, Ethan was still on the floor beside Lena's lifeless body, his face ashen, his eyes hollow. He didn't resist arrest, he barely spoke at all. The case exploded in the media, every lurid detail of their lives and Lena's hidden past sprawled across the headlines. The public devoured the story of a once promising officer who now faced charges of involuntary manslaughter. His career was shattered, his life reduced to ruins. As he sat in his prison cell, the memory of that terrible night became his relentless shadow. What had once been a love full of promise had turned into his greatest tragedy. In the end, all that remained were the secrets they had kept, the lies that unraveled them, and the irreversible consequences of choices he could never undo.